Genghis Khan, this was an entire nation, a massive one, an entire empire that just ate carnivore. They ate horse meat, they drank horse blood, they dominated most of Asia and most of Europe. This is the largest contiguous empire that has ever existed, and they ran solely on a carnivorous diet. And the king of Ethiopia asked the Persian emissary, "What do your people eat? How long do your people normally live?" Persian guy described making bread out of wheat. Our people would normally live around 70 years. And the king of Ethiopia sort of laughed at him and said, "Well, no wonder you live such short lives if all you eat is dirt." Anthropologically, looking at different populations around the world that have lived as carnivores and do survive as such and thrive. You have the Native Americans. They drove buffalo over the cliff. This is likely what our ancient mastodon hunters did as well. They maybe used fire or other sorts of techniques to spook these animals to run over a cliff and crash and die at the bottom, and they would use stone tools to cut them up and dry them and make pemmican basically in order to preserve that meat and fat and nutrition throughout the rest of the year. And they would do that. They would have one big buffalo drop a year sometimes, and they would feed their entire family and community for an entire year. They were also very, very strong, very, very powerful, very, very physically and mentally dominant people. Just because they didn't have technology, they didn't have the iPhone, does not mean that they weren't intelligent. It does not mean that they weren't more intelligent than we are now, and they likely were. When you have harder environments and situations to live in, it actually necessitates more intelligence and ingenuity. Now we have it pretty soft. We don't have to use our brain as much. We don't have to figure out how to survive. They did. And they actually, were quite a lot taller than they are now. There was Dr. Steve Finney has talked about this multiple times, but there was one example that he gave of these paintings of these Native Americans were very tall and slender with large heads. And they said that these guys were actually, and this was from the 1800s, early 1800s, and they would say that these guys were actually like 6'7", 6'8". And they're like, that's not possible. Look how big their heads are. They would have been like a beach ball. And no, in fact, they were. And there's a lot of documentation to show that. They actually came and met the great white father, Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time. And Thomas Jefferson, who was like 6'2", he even commented like these guys were giants. They were massive with big old heads, and big old head means big old brain. So that was a commonly recorded thing. We even have documentation of sailors coming over to the New World, and they were very brave. Talk about Indian braves. They were very brave. They had no fear. They would just jump out into the ocean, swim out to the boat, climb up there and walk around, just look around expecting people butt naked. They didn't have anything with them. And the captain actually wrote in his journal or whatever that subsequently became published that these guys, without a stitch of clothing on them, were just physical specimens, and they were more beautiful just in their nakedness than than any English gentleman in their finest regalia. They said these people were just beautiful and beautifully built, and very tall, and very strong, and very muscular. And this is something that we see as a rule around the world in these carnivore populations of humans. Genghis Khan, this was an entire nation, a massive one, an entire empire that just ate carnivore. They ate horse meat, they drank horse blood, they would have some fermented milk products as well. They dominated most of Asia and most of Europe. This is the largest contiguous empire that has ever existed, and they ran solely on a carnivorous diet, and that gave them extreme benefits and advantages to warfare and governing huge tracts of land. First and foremost, because they didn't need to eat 4 times a day. They didn't have to stop and cook and eat and have low energy all the time. They could go 5 days without eating. Then they would eat 10 pounds of horse meat in a go, and they'd be good for another 5 days. That actually routinely happened. Or they were on a ride and they're just going, and their horse would be bled. They would get some blood from the horse, and that would last them for the day or two. and their horse would make more blood, and they would just keep going. So this was a renewable resource as well, the blood of the horses, as well as the milk as well. And people talk about how agriculture was just the finest advent because this allowed us to have cities. Well, I'm sorry, we have the largest contiguous empire ever that existed on a carnivore diet, did not need agriculture, did not need farmland, did not need to grow crops and grains. And they had the largest contiguous empire that's ever existed. The only thing that eclipsed it as far as landmass is concerned was the British Empire more recently, but that was a naval power. That was scattered all over the world. This was one huge chunk of the world, and what is now Russia is really some of the remnants of the Mongol Empire. But look at a map sometime and just Google that and see just how big this empire was, and then see for yourself if you believe the whole idea that you had to have grains and agriculture to have a civilization or cities. The Native Americans did the same thing. There was a city that was found abandoned because of 95% of the Native Americans died off through diseases brought over from Europe accidentally in the early 1600s. And they found this city in what is now St. Louis that had buildings and structures that were estimated to be able to house 1 million full-time residents. And they had trade routes going off in 5 major directions all across the continent in order to bring in food and trade and goods and so forth. So right there was a city, a million people in it. That's the population size of ancient Rome as well. So it can be done. Then you have the Inuits, these and other populations that live up in the Arctic Circle. There's no plants to access, even if they wanted to, which they actually don't. There was a chronicle or journal of a New England settler and explorer that spoke about this, where a couple months out of the year in the more southern reaches of Canada, it was such that it would thaw out. And they said that okay, I understand that during the winters, they're very harsh. There are no plants. You can't cultivate anything, and so you have to just eat meat. But in the 2-3 months of the thaw, surely they can live off the bounty of the land, which is how he phrased it, which I thought was great. And he said, but they didn't. They did not do that. What they did was they ate meat, even in those times that they could have grown crops. Now, people say, well, they would have ate berries and did this, that, and the other. Especially when you go up further north, there really weren't berries accessible. And the ones that were these little lingonberries that are extremely sour. And in fact, most of them didn't like them. They didn't want to eat them. So, the gathering part of that hunter-gatherer motif was at most 2 months out of the year for things that no one really ate, like lingonberries. You have the Masai in Africa and many other populations and tribes out there as well. They still just eat meat. Look at these guys. They're tall, they're slender, they're strong. There were studies back in the 1980s looking at the Masai and saying like these guys are just built like Olympic athletes. They can just run forever. They never get tired. They never run out of energy. They just go, go, go. And they found that they thought that this must be because of the amount of exercise they did, because this was right when people were saying that fat and cholesterol killed you, made you fat and horrible and sick. And yet these guys were eating a lot of fat. They were drinking blood, drinking fatty milk, which is the milk of their livestock is about 8% milk fat, whereas ours is about 3.5 to 4% from cow's milk. So these guys were extremely healthy and extremely fit. And so they said, well, it must be because of their exercise level. They're just out there. They're out there being fit. And so they did a study and looked, and they found that, well, actually, no, not really. That on average, their daily exercise and energy expenditure through athletic endeavors was 1.6 times that of the average American, which was always said to be very sedentary, very slothful, bunch of couch potatoes, and with belly fat and no cardiovascular health. So that sort of throws that theory out the window as well. The native Australian Aboriginals. So much documentation about how these guys were hunters exclusively. They knew which plants that they could eat if they had to, but they didn't unless they had to or to use medicinally. they were hunters. They hunted kangaroo and other animals, and they exclusively ate meat. And they were very healthy. They're very tall. They actually had very, very tall, slender builds, just like the Maasai, very muscular and trim. And now that is not the case. So remember, I was talking about these human diseases. Those were really called the diseases of the West previously. So previously, diseases of the West were things like obesity and diabetes, heart disease, all these sorts of things. Heart disease really wasn't described until the 1900s, but people getting these sorts of diseases and getting sick, they only saw these in Western populations. And I remember learning as a kid that when eating a Western diet, Native Americans were 4 times as likely to get all the Western diseases, chronic diseases that we get today, like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, obesity as well. And I remember thinking at the time, well, doesn't that mean that the food is causing the disease? Because if they don't eat the food, they don't get the disease. And we eat the food and we get the disease, we just get it at a lower rate. And what is a Western diet versus a non-Western diet? What are they eating that we're not, and vice versa? They didn't say it at the time, but later learned that they were eating just a pure carnivore diet, maybe some plants sometimes if they had to, maybe, but generally they didn't. The vast majority of what they ate was just meat. And the Australian Aboriginals were no different. And in fact, when I first came to Australia to practice medicine, I learned right away that basically the health of the Australian Aboriginals was quite poor. And I was told that whenever treating an Aboriginal patient, that whatever their age said on their chart, just to add 20 years to that, because that is just how quickly they aged. And so if you had someone who's 45, you basically consider the diseases that someone would get in a 65-year-old, because that is just what you generally see. And so if you're seeing like a range of diseases or cancers in this from 60 to 70 or 60 to 80, you can actually look at that from 40 to 60 in the Aboriginal population. So that is seriously affecting them. And that is because they didn't have exposure to the agricultural revolution like European populations did, and others around Asia and India as well, and Northern Africa in certain parts. So these people are going to be much more affected by the plant toxins that exist to defend these plants against predation, and they are going to become more hurt. And this again goes back to the fact that these are not diseases. This is a poison dose relationship. When you remove this substance, these diseases go away. That is a toxic relationship. That is not a disease relationship. Okay. So you can even go further back and you look at Herodotus, and this is a story that I've told before, but I think it's very, very interesting. Herodotus was the father of history. He's the first person that started chronicling things down and giving us a historical record. He went all over the world and chronicled very important things, and that's the only reason we have records of a lot of these things and these wars and these meetings between different dignitaries of different countries. One of them was between a diplomat from the Persian Empire who went down to Ethiopia after Persia had taken over Egypt. And they were, talking, getting to know their new neighbors. And the king of Ethiopia asked the Persian emissary, what do your people eat and how long do your people normally live? And so the Persian guy described growing crops and making bread out of wheat. And they said that our people would normally live around 70 years. And the king of Ethiopia sort of laughed at him and said, well, no wonder you live such short lives if all you eat is dirt. We exclusively eat boiled meat from our livestock, and we only drink the milk from our livestock. And our people would live 120 years and sometimes more. And, that might sound a bit far-fetched. And in fact, in the Australian Aboriginals and the Inuits and Masai and Native Americans and other such cultures that just ate meat, they actually talk about this longevity. And Dr. Salisbury, chronicles that in his book in the 1800s. He lived with the Native Americans. They said these people were hale and hearty, running around with a pack on their back, following the buffalo herds day in and day out at 105, 110, 115 years old. They're not sitting in a nursing home turning to dust for 40 years. They're active adults in good health. All of this sounds very far-fetched to modern day people who start breaking down in their 30s and just start dying and getting, obese and heart disease and other sort of issues very early on in life. But we've actually known for about 20 years now as geneticists that chromosomally humans are designed to live about 120 years on average, meaning that if you just stay out of your own way and don't mess up, you should make it to 120 years without doing anything special. Okay, so why are we dying in our 60s and 70s on average? Right? That is literally middle-aged. And yet this is the common theme around the world, is that our bodies just start breaking down after 30. They really start breaking down after 40. And then you get into your older age in your 50s. And we call this a senior citizen. We get senior citizen discounts at 55 in some places. That's less than middle age. That should be in the prime of your adulthood. And yet it's not. And yet we're breaking down and getting more and more sick unless you don't eat things that cause harm.